In Magic the Gathering, when you play a creature, you're doing it because you hope that creature can help you win the game with decent stats, some relevant abilities, or both. However, not all creatures live up to this fairly low bar, and many of them can actively lead to you losing the game. And in this video, we're going to look at some of the worst creatures you can possibly play. Most of my MTG top 10s have an overarching category like worst blue creatures or worst 8 mana creatures, or maybe just worst creatures in general, and those are all top 10s I've done if you're interested, but this video is a bit different from what I typically do, because instead of this being a top 10 list of worst cards in a single category, I decided it'd be interesting to instead give you my pick for the worst creature card at each mana value, 1 through 10. So rather than being a top 10 list where cards in the same category get progressively worse, this is just kind of a parade of 10 terrible cards. Think of it as the worst curve out you could possibly ever have. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Let's start at the bottom of the curve with the worst 1 mana creature. While it's true you shouldn't necessarily expect an absolute world beater at only 1 mana, you should expect a card that actively helps you win the game either by giving you a nice aggressive stat line or generating some immediate value. But the bar for a 1-drop can be extra low because it's such a small amount of mana, but Alabaster Leech doesn't get anywhere close to clearing that low bar. It's 1 white mana for a 1/3 that makes your white spells cost an additional white mana. While it's true that a 1 mana 1/3 was a lot better back in the early 2000s, this isn't a case where a card that is bad today used to be good. It's a card that's always been terrible, and the downside has always been catastrophic, because making your own spells more expensive will hamstring you in a massive way, and all you get in return is a 1/3, a creature that isn't particularly good at attacking and is only moderately good at blocking. Most of the time, if you're playing an aggressive 1-drop, it should help you set up an awesome curve where you just keep playing creatures, and the fact you played one on every single turn is great, but this 1-drop actively makes it harder for you to curve out. You could try to get around the downside by not playing any other white cards, but if you're doing that, your chances of consistently having white mana on turn 1 aren't going to be good. As with all the cards in this list, casting this card will drastically increase your chances of losing. I always feel obligated when I'm talking about Alabaster Leech to point out that these days we got Staunch Shieldmate at common. That's a vanilla 1 mana 1/3, and that's not a good card either. And if we go back and look at the game when Invasion first came out in 2000, you can also find a 1 mana 1/3 that is significantly better, Brassman. So yeah, Alabaster Leech isn't good today, wasn't good in the past, and will never ever be good. The one minor exception to this can be making your opponent gain control of it so that they're the ones who suffer, like with Zedru, but it only affects their white spells, and not all of your opponents will even be playing that color, and most of them aren't going to be playing only white, so it still isn't really worth running. I think the worst 2 mana creature of all time is Mogg Squad. Like Alabaster Leech, it's an efficient-ish creature, but it has a massive downside. It's 1 generic and a red for a 3/3, but it gets -1/-1 for each other creature in play. So if it's all alone, Mogg Squad can be a pretty good beater, but getting -1/-1 for each other creature, that means yours and your opponent's, is absolutely horrendous. Rednecks usually have other creatures around, so at best it's going to be inefficient, and at worst, well, it basically comes with a built-in removal spell for your opponent, one they don't have to spend any mana or any cards on. That's especially true when they kill it just by playing their own creatures. Even worse, if the board has 3 or more creatures when you draw this, you're basically just paying 2 mana to put this thing directly in the graveyard. Saprazzan Raider is my pick for the worst 3 mana creature of all time. For 2 generic and a blue, it's a 1/2, not a good starting point. Surely the text box comes with upside. Well, obviously it doesn't, since this is my pick for the worst 3-drop of all time, and it's a doozy of a downside, because when it becomes blocked, it returns to your hand. Returning to your hand anytime it becomes blocked does mean that it can't die in combat, but it also means your opponent can just block this with anything to make you get behind on board and tempo. It basically means enhancing this creature in any way is meaningless too, since it returns before ever doing damage, and if it is equipped or has counters or whatever, those disappear when it bounces. So yeah, your opponent has no incentive not to just block this, And yes, if you put this in a deck that has some payoffs for creatures entering the battlefield, it gets kind of interesting, but there are quite literally hundreds of other cards that combo better with that sort of thing than this awful 3-mana 1/2. Wood Elemental is my pick for the worst 4-mana creature. For 3 generic and a green, it's a star. When it enters the battlefield, you sacrifice any number of untapped forests, and Wood Elemental's power and toughness are each equal to the number of forests sacrificed as it enters. Yeah, the only lands you can sacrifice to this are incredibly limited. Not only do they need forest typing, they have to be untapped. Because it only lets you sacrifice untapped forests, that means you can't sacrifice the lands you tap to cast Wood Elemental. For this to be a creature that has any stats at all, you're usually going to need to have 5 lands in play and have a forest left in play untapped after you spend the mana on it, just so you can sacrifice it. And congratulations, that means you just played a 4-mana 1/1 that made you sacrifice a land. And even if you have more lands around, it doesn't get any better. If you have 8 mana, you have a 4-mana 4/4 that made you sacrifice 4 untapped forests. Wood Elemental is never efficient and is often an entirely dead card, and when it isn't, it obliterates your mana base for a creature that isn't even worth it. And sure, there are incentives for sacrificing lands in Magic, but there are so many other cards that can do that in green that, aren't incredibly narrow. I mean, if you want to sack a bunch of lands in green, just use something like Sylvan Safekeeper or Spitting Spider, which actually do some other things, like being relevant creatures that don't cost a bunch of mana. Wood Elemental is an easy pick for the worst 4-mana creature ever printed. In fact, Wood Elemental is not only the worst 4-mana creature in Magic, I think it's the worst creature, period, and it's not particularly close. So as bad as the rest of the cards in this video are, Wood Elemental is probably the worst of them. My pick for the worst 5-mana creature is Righteous Avengers. For 4 generic and a white, it's a 3/1 with Planeswalk. While Wood Elemental is the worst card in this video, I think this one might be the best, but that's pretty sad because its woeful stats and minimal upside still make it an awful card. It's a notch or 2 above the other terrible cards on the list though. After all, it doesn't have any massive drawback built into it, other than having terrible stats. Being a 3/1 means it dies to pretty much everything. I mean, it dies to creature tokens and incidental ping effects, and that's just brutal for a 5-mana card that does nothing but attack or block. But hey, at least it comes with Planeswalk, and yeah, it's true that if you're playing against someone who is playing Plains, the low toughness matters less, and this can smash in for 3 a turn, but it's still a ton of mana for a card that is only conditionally unblockable. And even in those ideal situations, it isn't like your opponent's going to be living in fear of this thing by that stage of the game, since they'll probably be casting much more powerful things for 5 mana instead of a 3/1 with Planeswalk. Now we're moving into higher mana values, and if you're spending 6 or more mana on a creature, you're starting to expect a significant board presence that can really move the needle in your direction. After all, you're entering into the late game, or you've ramped your mana to reach this point. But there are plenty of terrible high mana creatures too, like Zephyr Spirit, which is Magic's worst 6-mana creature. For 5 generic and a blue, it's a 0/6. That's already a card that isn't really worth playing. It's purely defensive and can't even take anything down in combat, and that's not what you want to spend 6 mana on. But of course, they decided to give Zephyr Spirit a massive downside, one that is somewhat similar to Saprazzan Raider, because it bounces itself anytime something very common happens. In this case, Zephyr Spirit gets bounced anytime it blocks. That's right, pretty much the only thing this can do is block, and it's not even good at it. Because it gets bounced every time it blocks, that means if you want to have it keep having some impact on the board, you have to fork over 6 mana for a 0/6 every freaking turn, just so this thing can block something. It's like the worst fog ever that only blocks a single creature and costs 6 mana every time. This is even worse if the creature it has to block is small, and don't get me started on how bad this is against a Trampler. The one time when Zephyr Spirit feels not completely terrible is when your opponent has like one huge creature they're attacking with every turn, but how often is that the situation you find yourself in? And even then, it's not the card you're counting on to help you survive. If your game plan is just to spend 6 mana on this to block every turn while your opponent is spending their mana on more meaningful things, you're still going to lose the game. And that's the most optimal situation for Zephyr Spirit, and that makes it a horrendous card. Now let's move to the worst 7-mana creature. Of all the mana slots on this list, this is the one where I had the hardest time making a pick. For a time, I was thinking I'd go with Karplusan Giant, a 7-mana 3/3 that needs you to tap Snowland to give him +1/+1 until end of turn. But as horrible as he is, I ultimately decided there's an even worse 7-drop creature, because at least the giant can be huge in the right deck, even if it isn't generally right to use all your mana to buff your otherwise vanilla creature. But Mishra's War Machine is definitely worse. It's 7 mana for a 5/5 with banding, a much maligned keyword, but it is upside. It means that it can attack with at least one other creature without banding, forming a band with them, and your opponent blocks them as a group. But the part of banding that makes it actually good is the fact that you always get to control how damage is dealt in combat if you have a creature with banding involved, and that kicks in whether you're attacking with a band or not. Of course, this is just a 5/5, and if your opponent merely blocks with something big enough to take it down, which is pretty likely by the time you've spent 7 mana on this, banding does become meaningless. But yeah, War Machine is a 7 mana 5/5 with upside, however minimal, but it also comes with a downside, of course, because a 7 mana 5/5 was just too good, I guess. And that downside is that you have to discard a card at the beginning of your upkeep, and if you don't, it does 3 damage to you and gets tapped. So the upside does not match the downside, and this isn't a case where it's actually we're trying to turn the downside into upside. If you're interested in discarding cards, you can sometimes find a way to take advantage of that part of the card, but there are so many ways to discard cards whenever you want in Magic that there's no reason to run a creature like this one with way below rate stats in a really narrow window where it lets you discard a card, not to mention a massive punishment when you don't want to discard. You basically have to hold on to a card in your hand or Mishra's War Machine just shuts down, and that's not going to be worth it 99% of the time. Fun fact, a few years later in Urza's Destiny, Manticore was designed as a good Mishra's War Machine, and you can see how far they had to go to make a creature that forces you to discard during your upkeep actually worth it. Manticore is a much more efficient 4/4, and it has 2 powerful abilities. It can machine gun opposing creatures pinging them, and it can regenerate. Once you have a creature this efficient that can just kill opposing creatures with mana, it actually makes sense to have to discard a card every turn to keep it around, and for a time, Manticore was arguably the best creature in the game, but it's like a million times more powerful than its progenitor, Mishra's War Machine. My pick for the worst 8 mana creature is Akron Legionnaire. For 6 generic and 2 white, it's a miserable 8/4, and as you've likely come to expect from the cards in this list, it gets even worse when you read the text box, which in this case says, except for creatures named Akron Legionnaire and artifact creatures, creatures you control can't attack. That's right, you basically moat yourself when you play this, and the only payoff you get for it is a creature that wouldn't even be worth 8 mana if it was just vanilla. Sure, you can go hard and try to build around him by only having artifact creatures in your deck so you aren't affected by the downside, but that's some serious effort, and the juice definitely isn't worth the squeeze there. As is, the only kind of cool thing you can do with this is donate it to your opponent, and usually if that's the only way to make a card worth playing, it kind of proves that it's terrible. And even in that style of deck, it's not great, since it takes so long to cast it. My pick for the worst 9 mana creature in Magic is Leviathan. For 5 generic and 4 blue mana, it's a 10/10 with trample, but boy is it hard to actually get it to do anything. It enters tapped and doesn't untap during your untap step. It makes you sacrifice 2 lands just to untap it, and you can only choose to do that during your upkeep. And then it can't attack unless you sacrifice 2 more islands. In other words, it takes 4 islands per turn if you want this to do anything, and you probably do, because it's a 10/10 trampler. But to do that, it destroys your mana base and still dies to a whole lot of removal. Even back when the Dark released, there were a boatload of ways to destroy it, which was especially problematic after you gave up 4 islands just to feel like Leviathan is actually adding to the board. It's basically impossible to get around the downside too. It isn't like reanimating it in the early game solves the problem, since it still needs to gobble up islands or it'll never do anything. So there's basically never a time when Leviathan will be a play that helps you win a game. Instead, like the other cards in this list, casting this creature is likely to lead to you losing the game. Now let's wrap things up with the worst 10 mana creature, Stratadon. It's 10 mana for a 5/5 trampling artifact creature, which is terrible. But at least things don't get worse when we read the text box in this case. In fact, things get better, because Stratadon costs 1 generic mana less to cast for each basic land type among lands you control. This means the absolute ceiling on Stratadon is a 5 mana 5/5 trampler, and no, it can't cost 4 mana because wastes don't count. And while that ceiling is a lot better than the ceilings of the other cards in this list, it takes some serious work to make it happen. And even paying 6 for this is going to feel miserable, and anything more than that will feel downright awful. It's just not worth the effort of having a 5-color mana base to play a creature like this one. So, those are the worst creatures at every mana cost 1 through 10. If you want to own any of these terrible cards because, I don't know, maybe you like losing, check out the description where you can find a direct card kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you enjoyed this video and like that it's a change up from my usual MTG top 10s, let me know by liking the video or commenting on it, and maybe I'll make some more like this. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards ever printed, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.